to do her duty. The 5th of August, 1813, Margate, a small grey cottage, let for the summer. Mrs. Bennet pushed her eggs away, suddenly not able to stand the sight of them. She sipped at her tea slowly, and soon felt right again. It had happened several times of late, but with all the excitement of her eldest daughter's weddings, she hadn't noticed much beyond the wedding preparations. Later that afternoon, she stood up quickly on the terrace, and everything became a bit fuzzy. She didn't faint, but for a moment she had been light-headed. She shook it off and went about her day. By evening she'd forgotten all about it and went to her room to change her dress for dinner. "I'll wear the green gown," she said to her maid. The woman nodded and brought out the dress, helping her mistress to change. When she got to the buttons at the top of the bodice, she struggled to close them. "What's the problem, Higgins?" asked Mrs. Bennet.
"The buttons won't close, madam. Do you want me to force them?"
"No, it will likely just ruin the dress. I'll wear the blue sprig, it's looser." The maid quickly helped her out of the dress and retrieved the other, leaving Mrs. Bennet alone in front of the mirror. She looked at her body critically, wondering what had changed. Since coming to the seaside, her clothes had been looser, not tighter. She'd found the sea air had slimmed her figure slightly, though she'd never been plump. Now she looked quite robust. Her cheeks were full and bright, and her breasts were practically bursting out of her shift. Shaking her head, she moved her hand slowly over her abdomen. Realization gripping her mind. It couldn't be. The physician said it was impossible. Her womb had been too damaged. Lydia's birth had been too difficult. She would never conceive again. He'd said. He had been so sure. But could it be? She would be 41 in October. Her aunt had delivered a child at 42, but it had not survived. Her cousin had burst at 39, and it had cost her life. If she was, in fact, with child, would she carry it safely? Would she finally fulfill her duty and birth a son? Would the babe survive? Would she?
"Here's the blue dress," said Higgins.
Mrs. Bennet stepped into the gown, and her mind whirred with possibilities. When had she last had her courses? Had it only been the once since they arrived in Margate? That meant she was at least 2 months along, likely a little more, if she was pregnant at all. "Higgins, have any of my other dresses seemed tight?"
"1 or 2, madam. I hadn't thought much of it."
"And when did I last have my courses? Was it in May?"
"Yes, we'd been here about 10 days, I believe."
Higgins' head suddenly snapped up.
"Madam!"
"Shh! We don't know anything for certain yet. I need you to take a note to the apothecary asking him to attend me. He'll have to come when Mr. Bennet is off on one of his walks. I'll say I have a headache and stay behind. Make sure no one sees him," she said firmly.
"Yes, mistress."
Higgins curtsied quickly and ran off with the hastily written note. The apothecary came 2 days later and agreed it was highly likely she was with child. He estimated she was nearly 3 months along. He said she would know for certain when the babe quickened, to which she rolled her eyes. She had done this 5 times before. She knew how to be certain of a pregnancy. What she really wanted to know was what chance the babe had. And was there anything she could do to ensure a son? He told her he knew of nothing to ensure a male birth other than eating plenty of meat and getting lots of fresh air. She was in good health and fit, and he believed her chances of surviving the birth were good as long as the babe would not breech or a twin. So as long as she was properly attended by a competent midwife, he thought all would be well. She thanked him and sent him on his way, then sat down in complete shock. She was going to have a baby. Or very likely she was. She should know in a month or 2 when it was time for the babe to move. How would she ever bear the weight? The Bennets returned to Longbourn the second week of September. Mrs. Bennet was occupied with reopening the house, and Mr. Bennet stayed busy with the harvest. Letters were flying between the remaining sisters and the recently married Jane and Elizabeth. Catherine would be 18 in October and would be officially out by London standards, where she would spend more than a month with her sister Jane after the festive season. Her father thought she was finally ready. Mrs. Bennet was planning a party to celebrate the occasion, and Kitty was to have a large allowance for new clothes. The day before Catherine's birthday, as Mrs. Bennet was supervising the decorating of the dining room for the small party, she felt a fluttering in her stomach. It was very faint and gone in an instant, but she had definitely felt something. She waited, and in a few minutes more felt it again. Quickly excusing herself, she went to her room and sat in the window seat, totally silent. She pressed her hand to her abdomen, and there it was, a small fluttering, like a tickling sensation deep inside. It was not strong enough to feel with her hand yet, but she had been in this position sufficient times to know what it was. She was with child. The harvest was completed by the end of October, and the entire family was ready to depart for Derbyshire to see Elizabeth's new home. Mr. Bennet hoped the journey wouldn't be too tedious. Everyone had been in such good spirits of late. Catherine was glad to be 18, Mary was less pedantic without Lydia to moralise to, and his wife had been in an excellent mood since they went to the seaside. He couldn't remember the last time he saw her ask for her smelling salts, and she had been remarkably pleasant to everyone around her for some time. Assuming the serenity he was witnessing was the result of having daughters so advantageously married, he chose not to question it, and instead to enjoy his good fortune. Little did he know his wife was about to give him some very unexpected news that would have him wishing for smelling salts. The journey to Pemberley was completed in good time, and the Bennets were greeted by both the Darcys and the Bingleys. Dinner was a joyous affair, and everyone laughed and drank and talked over each other, but no one seemed to mind. "Where is your sister, Mr. Darcy?" asked Mrs. Bennet.
She is visiting my aunt and uncle. She will be here in a few days, along with my cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam.
"Oh, the Colonel!" cried Mrs. Bennet. Jane and Elizabeth rolled their eyes and laughed at each other's expressions.
"If I may have everyone's attention for a moment," said Bingley, as he stood at the table. Everyone quieted and looked toward him. "While we've been touring the north, Jane and I have viewed a few estates, and I'm happy to say we've found one to purchase. We take possession next month." The table erupted with good wishes for the future and lamentations, mostly from Mrs. Bennet, that they would move away from Hertfordshire. "Where is it located?" asked Mr. Bennet. "It is in Yorkshire, only 25 miles away."
"Oh, how lovely!" cried Catherine. More good wishes ensued until Mr. Bennet stood and cleared his throat.
"Since we're all gathered together, and this seems to be an evening for announcements, I have one I'd like to make."
He looked at the expectant faces of his 4 grown daughters and took a deep breath.
To my surprise, and I imagine hers as well, Mrs. Bennet is expecting a child. The babe should be born sometime in March, perhaps February.
He looked around at the stunned faces and smiled. Mrs. Bennet grabbed his sleeve and pulled him down next to her, oddly nervous about sharing this news with her children. No one said anything for several minutes, until Mr. Bingley, bless him, spoke up.
"Congratulations! What a welcome surprise!"
More congratulations followed, though most sounded confused and weak. "Did you know?" Elizabeth whispered to Mary. "No, I had no idea." She shook her head. "I thought she looked a little plump, but that wasn't so extraordinary. She has been eating quite a lot." At the realization of what she'd said, both sisters laughed and tried to hide it behind their hands.
"Congratulations, Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet," said Mr. Darcy softly. "Thank you, son," said Mr. Bennet, equally quiet. "I can imagine it was quite a surprise." "Yes, I don't know when I've been more shocked," Bennet said. "But I am quite excited as well. It's been so long since we've had a little one at Longbourn, I've quite forgotten what it's like."
Elizabeth was still reeling from the news hours later as she prepared for bed. She paced in her dressing room, and when that room proved too small to do the activity justice, she removed to her chamber, where she quickly made a rut in the carpet. "Can you believe my mother is going to have a baby at her age?" cried Elizabeth as Darcy entered the room.
"I cannot, and yet she is," replied Darcy, equally dumbfounded.
"How can it be, after all these years with nothing, and suddenly—" She trailed off. "Do you suppose it was the seaside?"
"Anything is possible."
"She did say that sea bathing would do her good," said Elizabeth slyly.
"Leave it to you to find humour in every situation," he said, as he climbed into the bed.
"One must laugh, my love, or we would spend all our time crying," she reasoned as she joined him under the counterpane. He kissed her forehead and looked into her worried eyes for a moment, a silent understanding passing between them. Elizabeth shook her head and the moment passed. "I suppose I should not be concerned with my fecundity. Apparently the women in my family are quite proficient at producing children." He placed a hand over her stomach.
"When did you say we would know for sure?"
"Not for another month at least. I knew I shouldn't have told you before I was sure. Now you've got your hopes up, and if it isn't to be, you'll be disappointed and I'll feel terrible."
"Nonsense. I could never be disappointed in you, and I much prefer to know. You were sleeping so much I was getting worried. I prefer a little of the unknown to worrying about your health."
"All right. I will inform you of my every ache and suspicion in the future," she teased.
"As you should," he returned with a mischievous smile.
The 27th of February, 1814. Longbourn, an east-facing bedchamber. Agnes Bennet woke early with a pain in her back and a sharp ache in her side. Rolling over, she felt as if her belly was gripped in a vice and called out for Higgins.
"Oh, mistress, it's your time."
Higgins bustled about the room, pouring a jug of water into the basin and rinsing her lady's forehead. "How bad is it?" "The baby's coming today," she said. "I'm sure of it. Send a boy for the midwife." She rose and walked around the bed, grabbing the post for support when a hard pain gripped her. She looked at the window at the weak sunshine and thanked God it was daylight. Night labours always felt ominous to her. Mr. Bennet strode into her room, an anxious look on his face.
"How are you, my dear?"
"Well enough," she smiled wanly. He kissed her forehead and squeezed her hand as she breathed through another pain. "Now, off with you. This is no place for a man," she said softly. She gave him a beatific smile, and he stole a quick kiss from her lips and left the room. By the 6th hour of labour, Agnes Bennet was covered in sweat and hanging onto her maid for support.
"We're almost there, Mrs. Bennet, just a few more,"
said the midwife encouragingly. Agnes gritted her teeth as another contraction racked her body.
"Tell me when you feel the urge to bear down,"
said the midwife. Agnes nodded as the pains crashed over her, one after another, relentlessly pushing her to the edge of herself, until finally she knew what would bring her relief. She heard the voices of the midwife and her maid saying something, but could not make it out. Then she was on the birthing chair and pushing with all her might.
"Very good, Mrs. Bennet. Breathe and give me another good push," said the midwife authoritatively.
Releasing a mighty groan, Agnes bore down with all her strength and felt a great gush followed by blessed relief. Her head lolled back, and she heard the busy sounds of scissors cutting and cloths being gathered. "You've done very well, Mrs. Bennet. Now it's time for the afterbirth," the midwife told her. Agnes lifted her head and saw Mrs. Hill, the housekeeper, cleaning the baby, and finally, a tiny cry broke the air. She cried out her relief that it was over, and let Higgins lead her to the bed and help her into a clean nightgown. In what felt like an instant, the women gathered the dirty cloths and removed the chair, and a swaddled baby was placed in her arms. "You've a healthy baby boy, Mrs. Bennet," said the midwife. She smiled at the lady as she continued to massage her abdomen. "A son! I have a son!" she cried, exhausted but triumphant. "Higgins, more cloths, please," said the midwife in a low voice. Higgins looked towards the midwife and wondered at the serious expression on her face. "Ask for more hot water and fetch the master." She said the last with such a look that Higgins fairly flew out of the room. "My boy, my beautiful, perfect boy," Mrs. Bennet cooed wearily to the infant in her arms. She helped him latch onto her breast and leaned her head back, her eyes closing. Mr. Bennet burst into the room and went immediately to his wife's side. "Agnes!" "Thomas," she said weakly, "look, we have a son." She smiled radiantly at him, and he nearly cried with joy. "Yes, we do. What shall we call him?" "Thomas John," she said. "After me and your father?" She nodded. "I like that," he said warmly. She closed her eyes and smiled. He looked to the midwife, and she looked back gravely, then slowly shook her head. Bennet stilled and felt a cold chill race down his back. He looked at his wife and noted how pale she was, and then looked back to the midwife, who was placing a blood-soaked cloth into a pail. He kissed his wife's forehead and brushed her hair back. "I love you, Agnes." He kissed her limp hand. "I love you so dearly." She opened her eyes slowly and rolled her head to look at him. "I've done it. You have a son, Mr. Bennet," she breathed. "I've finally done my duty."
"Aye, Agnes, you have. You've saved us all," he choked.
She smiled and closed her eyes, sinking into the soft white pillows. The 1st of March, 1814, Pemberley, Derbyshire. The butler was sorting the post onto salvers when an express arrived. Reading the direction of the dispatch, his face went white. Calling the nearest footman to him, he handed him the letter. "Get this to Mrs. Darcy, quick as you can," he ordered urgently. The footman took off at a run, taking the stairs 2 at a time, until he reached the mistress's sitting room. Mrs. Darcy was sitting in front of the window, talking animatedly with Miss Darcy, when the footman caught her attention. She took the letter from him, immediately noticing the black ink around the edge of the envelope and her sister Mary's handwriting. "Fetch Mr. Darcy," she said hoarsely, and the footman took off again, running to the master's study. "Lizzie, who is it from?" Georgiana asked. "It is from Longbourn," she said, with shaking hands and a horrible sense of dread. She broke the seal. "Dearest sister, I bear ill tidings. Our mother has been delivered of a son, Thomas John. Unfortunately, she did not survive the birth. The midwife said it was impossible to save her. I am so sorry to tell you, Lizzie, but our mother is dead. Thomas is healthy and well, but our father is beside himself with grief. He has not left his room since the birth, and Kitty spends all her time holding the baby and weeping silently. Please come, Lizzie. You may be the only one Papa will listen to. He has not left his study all day,
and takes no food or drink. The funeral is scheduled for Tuesday next. I will send this express in the hope that you can arrive soon after, if not before. Your sister, Mary Bennet." Elizabeth closed her eyes and hot tears spilled down her cheeks.
"Is it from Longbourn?" asked Darcy as he rushed into the room.
"My mother," she said quietly. "I have a brother. She did not survive his birth." Her hand absently stroked her swollen abdomen as Darcy's gaze followed her movement and his eyes widened. He took the letter she offered him and read it quickly, then snapped into action as she knew he would. Within 2 hours, they were on the road to Hertfordshire.